Thank you. Go.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Package Tourist, hosted by yours truly, The Package Tourist, the magical mystery tour called Life, Matthew DiBiase. Tonight's guest is author Noel Hynd. Noel has written dozens upon dozens of books which have sold more than 7 million copies throughout the world. Although today he lives on the West Coast, Noel was born in New York City and raised in New York State and Connecticut. He got a degree in international relations from the University of Pennsylvania and published his first novel in 1975 when he was only 28. His works of fiction run the gamut from supernatural thrillers to international action-suspense spy novels to psychological horror and terror stories. And as a result, Noel has earned well-deserved acclaim from distinguished literary critics and societies alike for his magnificent body of work. Noel has also written articles for Sports Illustrated, Harpers, and other esteemed magazines, and has published books on baseball as well. Tonight, we will discuss his latest release, A Brooklyn Guy, the greatest Brooklyn Dodger you never heard of, a biography of Brooklyn Dodgers catcher Otto Miller. Noel, welcome back to the show. It's been a long time, and it's great to have you on again.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Go ahead.
That's a great honor, Noel, yes. Noel, I'd like to start off by asking you, what led you to write a biography of Otto Miller?
Well, a couple things. First of all, nobody's ever done it before, so that was a good place to start. But when I've written, as you know, a lot about New York baseball, about the Giants and the Dodgers, and Otto Miller's name kept popping up. And over the years, I kept asking myself, who was this guy? For example, when I wrote a book called The Final Game at Ebbets Field, I came very quickly across the fact that Otto Miller was at the closing ceremony at Ebbets, standing right there with Campanella and Sandy Koufax, who was with the team in 1957. And then I learned from that Mr. Miller had been the opening day catcher at the ballpark. And I thought, wow, this guy was there in 1913, I guess it was, when the park opened.
Yeah.
And there in 1957. And then later on, he was there at the saddest of all of the ceremonies, the demolition. So then, as I kept seeing his name, he turned up in a lot of historical baseball events, which I know were in Dodgers, and I thought, this guy's there. He saw so baseball history. He participated in so much, and nobody knows who he is anymore. That's why I call him the greatest Dodger who nobody's ever heard of.
Wow. Noel, when you were doing your research, what records were you able to find on him while researching this book? And what was the biggest surprise you uncovered about his life?
What I did was I went into newspapers.com, which most of us nonfiction writers live by, and I started to access the Brooklyn newspapers from the era. So I got a lot of information out of that, and I also went to the predictable statistic sources such as Baseball Reference. And Baseball Reference really is numbers. It's a great source, but it doesn't really tell the story. The tricky thing about researching a fellow from the dead ball era was that sports writers did not go into the locker rooms at the time. Dick Young was the first guy who really did that. So you didn't get a lot of the quotes and the personal feedback that you get in, say, post-World War II reporting.
Okay.
So some of a lot of the newspapers of the era were very, very helpful, and also the art of sports cartooning was just coming in. So as I was able to reprint in the book, you got a lot of very, very interesting and, to our mind, primitive artwork of the players of the era.
Okay, let's begin in the beginning. Where was Otto Miller born and raised?
He was born in Minden, Nebraska, which in 1889, June 1st of that year. It was the edge of the frontier at the time. There was a train station and a store, and I think that was about it. He was not there very long because I traced him down in the U.S. censuses of the era, and the family later moved back to Minneapolis. When he was a boy, he went to the Indianapolis schools. When he was a teenager, he went to an Indianapolis high school. He played baseball, not surprisingly, and like a lot of kids from the era, he wanted to play a ball player. He wanted to be a ball player, but didn't know whether he was good enough, and he eventually found out.
Okay. So was he always a catcher?
I have no reports of him playing any other position aside from a couple of times over his long career with the Dodgers. He had to fill in at first base, but he was basically a catcher. He was a big guy for the era in particular. He was a 6-foot kid in high school, and even when he got to the Dodgers among the pro players in 1910, he was one of the biggest players on the team, even though in 1910 he was the youngest player.
Yeah, that was extraordinary. To be over 6 foot back then, that was extraordinary. I just like to explain to my listeners, people were much smaller back then. Like a century or more ago, people were much smaller. I think the average height was more like 5'6" or 5'7" or 5'8". So to be a 6-footer was quite extraordinary a century ago, ladies and gentlemen.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Where did he play baseball in the minors, and how did the Brooklyn Dodgers sign him?
Well, all of those things are usually by luck. But the Dodgers were playing second fiddle to the Giants in New York at the time. The Giants were the Giants of John McGraw, Christy Mathewson. They were a world-famous team, and the Dodgers, who were not even known as the Dodgers then, except as an informal nickname, were sort of the poor cousins over on the other side of the bridge. And up until right before the turn of the century, there wasn't even a bridge, so it was a ferry situation to get over there. Anyway, the ownership of the Dodgers, Charlie Ebbets was part of the ownership, was tired of being second fiddle to the Giants. And the Giants had a great scout named Dick Kinsella, who was all over the country signing players. Ebbets came up with a guy named Larry Sutton, who had some minor jobs in baseball in the New York area, and hired him to go around and look at young players and beat the Giants to the kids that the Dodgers could use. Sutton came up with Zach Wheat and had to talk the ownership of the Dodgers, or Brooklyn, into signing Wheat because his batting average wasn't that good. And Larry, to use a great New York expression, just said, "Trust me, trust me." Wheat turned out to be really good, and a year later, he came back and said, "You know, the catcher that we have, Bill Bergen, is getting older. We're not getting any offense out of the catching position. I got a kid here who might be able to fill in for you." And so they signed Miller.
Okay, so his rookie season, what was it? What year was his rookie season?
1910, and he did not play very much.
Okay. Now, as when he finally became a more regular player, what was he like as a player in terms of his hitting and his fielding, and what was his on-field demeanor, and what was he like in the clubhouse?
Well, you have to start with the fact that the catcher he replaced, Bill Bergen, to this day has the lowest career batting average of anybody who has ever played more than 2,500 at-bats in the major leagues. Bergen hit 170, but he persisted for at least a 10-year career because he was an extraordinarily gifted defensive catcher. Miller brought the same defensive ability to the game. He could throw out runners from a sitting position. He was very, very good at fielding balls that were knocked into the dirt above in front of the plate. And best of all, for the era, he was remarkably gifted at catching spitballs. He was a very calm guy. He was kind of a big, steady guy, sort of the way you might remember Johnny Bench as just being a quiet presence a lot of the time behind home plate.
Yeah.
So a catcher very, very much ran the game back in that era. And he was very good at doing that. This is the type of thing that doesn't turn up in the statistics other than the fielding statistics.
Okay. Now, what was he like on the field? Was he very aggressive? I mean, like Casey Stengel when he was a player, he was very feisty and all that. Was Miller feisty, or was he mild-mannered? And what was he like in the clubhouse with his teammates?
He was very, very mild-mannered, but people could get under his skin. The thing is, the writers liked him very much, and if he was into some kind of altercation, let's put it this way, if he got into a fight, he took it underneath the stands. He'd go looking for a guy and say, I didn't like what you did out there, but he kept it private. He had kids loved him. He was sort of like the big uncle or the big older brother. So it was a very sort of peaceful demeanor at the plate, but in my opinion, looking back at pictures of him and looking back at his presence, the guy was just tough as you could imagine, standing strong at the plate, blocking the plate. There's a famous picture, I got it for the book, of the 1916 World Series where he blocks the plate in the famous game against Babe Ruth, which sent the game from the 9th inning all the way into the 14th inning. And you can see the runner trying to kick the ball out of Miller's hands, and you just couldn't do it. Again, he was bigger than a lot of the other base runners, so he could stand there. But I would just say quiet and tough as nails.
Who are his best friends on the team?
That is a very easy. He was very good friends with Zach Wheat, from what I can tell. But one of the hazards of writing a book about an era like this is there's just nobody around anymore who you could talk, or even grandchildren, I think. But he was a close friend of Zach Wheat. One of the revelations that I came across when I was researching the book was he was a very close friend of Casey Stengel. And he was Casey's roommate when the team traveled together. Somebody one time asked Miller something about what kind of conversations do you have with Casey, because Casey was a chatterbox all of his life. He would just keep talking. And he said something to the effect of, well, it wasn't much of a conversation. Casey was always talking. It was nonstop. I never said anything. So it was very much like that. But the funny thing is, it was obviously a attraction of opposites, because Casey was outgoing, he was brash, he was in your face, he was getting under you as a bench jockey, and Miller was just quietly steady, behind the plate. Almost reminded me, when I was writing the book, of Charlie Watts with the Rolling Stones. You got Richards out there, you got Jagger out in front, and Charlie Watts is just back there on the drums.
Okay. Did Otto Miller have any type of a nickname?
Yeah, they called him Mooney, and it was a nickname that I think he even got. He may have had it in the minor leagues, but when he first went to spring training with the Dodgers in 1910 in Hot Springs, Arkansas, people started calling him Mooney because he had this big round face, usually smiling. It was like those old depictions of the man on the moon, the type of thing you saw in the very, very primitive French movies of the Earth to the Moon.
Yeah. Okay. Now, you said you started his career in 1910. He was always with the Dodgers, so it's safe to assume he was there when the Dodgers won pennants in 1916 and 1920, correct?
That is correct. He was, in fact, the regular... He was more or less the regular catcher. In the 1915 and 16, I believe they brought over Chief Myers, who had been the great catcher for the Giants. But Miller was there, and it basically depended on who was... he was the regular guy, and it was often depending on who was pitching and who was injured.
What was his relationship with Wilbert Robertson, who was the manager of the Dodgers during those two pennant drives and for a very long time? How did he get along with Robbie?
He got along very, very well with Robbie. They knew each other because both of them through New York baseball events, because obviously Robbie had been with the Giants. And there was Robinson had been a very, very good defensive catcher himself. So the personalities matched very much. There was the only time there's ever any kind of sparks flying between them was, I believe, that Miller had an ingrown toenail or something at one point in 1915, and it was bothering him. So Miller said, "Let me see." Robinson said, "Let me see it." Miller holds up his foot in the clubhouse, and with his bare hands, Robinson pulls the toenail out. And this is like third world hygiene or something. But apparently Miller was hopping around the hallway under the ballpark for a few hours after that.
Oh, my. What was his performance in the 1916 World Series like? How well did he do?
Well, first of all, the Dodgers lost it pretty completely. They ran into a tremendous team, which was the 1916 Red Sox. Miller played in, I think, 2 of the 3 games. He got one of Babe Ruth beat the Dodgers 2-1 in 14 innings. Ruth pitched the entire game against a Dodger pitcher named Sherry Smith. And Miller got 1 single. He got himself into scoring position, and that was it. Offensively, as I said, he had a tremendous play, cutting down a runner trying to score on a sacrifice fly in the 9th inning of that same game, which sent it into overtime.
Okay. Now, Noel, is it true that Otto Miller was part of Bill Wambsganss's immortal triple play in Game 5 of the 1920 World Series?
That is absolutely true. Wambsgans was at second base in the 5th inning in Cleveland. It was a game that was played at League Park, which is the stadium that preceded Municipal Stadium, and the batter for the Dodgers was Clarence Mitchell, and a fellow named Pete Kilduff, I think, who was an infielder, was on first base. Miller got on, I think, as a walk. Miller almost always batted 8th, by the way, so he was frequently batting in front of the pitcher. Clarence Mitchell was a very good hitting pitcher, and Bill Wambsgans, who was later interviewed in The Glory of Their Times by Lawrence Ritter, remembered that with Mitchell up, he wasn't playing exactly where he might have played for a pitcher, and he expected that if Mitchell hit the ball, he would hit maybe a ball over second base that went into center field. So Wambsgans was cheating towards second, and Mitchell hits a line drive. Miller sees where it's going, doesn't realize that Wambsgans has moved over. Wambsgans, the second baseman, obviously, catches the ball, one out, his momentum takes him to second base. He steps on second, and he turns around, and Miller is standing there absolutely astonished, about 10 feet away. And according to some accounts, Miller says, "What ball is that?" And Wambsgans says, "It's the one they just hit." And quickly goes to him, tags him, and that was it. And according to accounts of the play in 1920 in the newspapers, there was just a stunned silence for several seconds, because how long does a triple play take?
Yeah.
3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds? Man, if you were lighting up your stogie or something, you missed it.
Yeah.
And so that was it. And then the crowd started to applaud. And the next day, I got this picture for the book also. The next day, a couple of photographers lined up Wambsgans with his 3 victims, as he called it, and took a picture of baseball history.
Yeah, and in fact, in The Glory of Their Times, I remember reading that as a kid. There's that picture. Wamsgans got the ball. He had just finished tagging second base. There's Otto Miller standing there dumbfounded. Kildoff was already running at third. He doesn't even realize he's already been out because Wamsgans has stepped on second, and it's just seconds before Wamsgans tags Otto Miller and all that. Yeah, I mean it's incredible. Yeah, I mean I remember as a kid. Actually, that Game 5 1920 series, it would not only had the first unassisted triple play, it had the first home run hit by a pitcher and also the first World Series Grand Slam home run. So it was quite a game.
It was quite a game, and I'm sorry I wasn't there, but I wasn't even born yet.
I know, yeah. Okay, what did Miller do after his playing career ended?
Well, he stayed in baseball for as long as he could. He was seen as managerial or coaching material by just about everybody. So he went to Atlanta. He liked the city. He went to Atlanta, and he managed in 1923. His last year with the Dodgers was 1922. He played for 13 seasons in Brooklyn. So then he went to the minor leagues to manage, and he later turned up managing at Indianapolis in one of the 2 years following. In 1924. 1925, he took the year off and was playing back in Brooklyn for the Bushwicks, I think, for a while, and then was hired by the Dodgers again to come over and be a coach and work with pitchers and catchers. After that, which I think is where your question was going, he stayed in Brooklyn and lived in Brooklyn. He had his family there, and he was often playing for the Bushwicks, which were the great semi-pro team of the era. And he also tended bar, managed a couple of bars in Flatbush, and basically stayed in the city. He loved Brooklyn.
What part? Okay, so he had a bar in Flatbush. Where was the home? What segment of Brooklyn? Because Brooklyn has a lot of neighborhoods. What neighborhood did he and his family reside in?
When he was a player and a coach, he was in Flatbush, and I have the address of the bar in the book. I think there was an address. I know it was a couple of. It was like a 2-minute walk from Ebbets Field. And I also had in the book. I got his draft registration cards from both World War I and World War II, and it lists the. I'm fanning on the name right now, but exactly what the address was where he lived with his wife and his children. And then later on, he moved out to Ocean Avenue after he had fully retired from coaching.
Okay, now you mentioned this earlier. How did it come about he was present when the last game at Ebbets Field was played in 1957? How did he get there? How was he able to attend that game?
Well, I assume he probably walked because he was still in Flatbush at the time because he was running a bar in 1957. The Dodgers invited him. The Dodgers thought it was, Miller was well known to be at almost any kind of baseball event in New York. He would turn up at the banquets, he would speak, he would go to high schools, he would instruct at high schools. He was a guy who was frequently seen. If you needed an old Dodger, you got Otto Miller because he was dependable, he was personable, and people liked him. So it was just kind of a natural that he would be invited over since he was the opening day catcher at Ebbets Field in 1913, and so they wanted him there to close the ballpark also.
Was he able to get any type of physical memento from the park after the last game? Anything of that nature?
Not that I'm aware of. I do know that when there were two major events involving the closing of Ebbets Field. There was the last game the Dodgers played in 1957, and then in 1960 the park was scheduled to be demolished, which was a enormously sad occasion.
Yeah.
And he turned up. He was invited to that event also, and he hung out with Campy, Roy Campanella, who eventually took his place behind home plate. And somebody dug up a patch of the ground from the field behind home plate that both men had played on, which probably was pretty close to maybe 2,000 games, 1,500, 2,000.
Yeah. Wow.
And there's a picture, which I also have in the book, of Otto handing the urn to Campy, who was in a wheelchair. And you can see in the background that the park is like minutes away from destruction. Miller cried at that ceremony. He said, "I don't care. This is just too much. Some men are ashamed to cry. I am not. This was home. This was part of him that was coming down with the record wall."
I'll tell you, when the beginning of Ken Burns' episode about his series Baseball, the 1960s episode, it begins with the demolition of Ebbets Field. And I'll tell you, even though I did Ebbets Field my whole life, you get a tear in your eye when you see that. I can't imagine what it was like being there in person and having to see that. And there's film footage of Campy getting that urn of dirt there and at that ceremony there. So it's a very poignant ceremony, when you look at it. Don't you agree, Noel?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I've never seen that, but if that is the case, that's probably one of the few films that exists of Otto Miller.
Yeah.
If they showed that being handed to him.
Yeah, I mean, it's the very beginning of, I forget, the episode dealing with the 1960s. It's the very beginning of that episode there. I mean, you could probably see it on YouTube or whatever. It's one of my favorite episodes, the one dealing with the 60s and all that. Yeah. Okay, after the demolition of Ebbets Field, what did Otto Miller do in the final years of his life? At what year did he pass away, and where is he buried?
He basically stayed in Brooklyn. He often would, sports writers, if they needed a story, would come and see him. He tended bar for a long time, as I mentioned. This is, I guess, the era from 57 to his death in 1962. He would... old Dodger fans would come in to the bar just to talk to him. It was really quite something. You could just walk up to the bar. Well, I guess if you were legal age, or since it was Brooklyn, maybe not even that. And you could go in, and a lot of people brought postcards and had him sign them. He never charged for it. Signed the back of it, and then they mailed them to their friends. And you had an autograph of a Dodger. I have one of them myself. I didn't get them from it directly, but it just says Otto Miller, and that's his writing. He turned up again at a lot of charity events and any kind of baseball banquet or something in the off season that he might have been invited to.
Were you able to interview or talk to any of his descendants?
No, I couldn't find anyone, and the few that I did contact kind of gave me the heave-ho, to tell you the truth.
Oh, sorry.
They were sort of indirectly related. They said that they didn't know anything about that branch of the family.
Okay.
What broke my heart was his wife, whom he married, who was also a Brooklyn girl, whom he married in I think 1915, kept a scrapbook for his entire career and had clippings about everything he had done whenever he hit a home run, and she even had kept correspondence from the league office. Apparently he got fined a couple of times for arguments with umpires, which was never in the papers. And he was in a couple of fights with other players under the stands and got suspended one time for something, for one of those brawls. But I could never find out what happened to the scrapbook.
Oh, wow.
His wife died in 1964, and of course that's 60 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's a long time for something to get lost.
Yeah.
But Always wondered whether it's just been sitting in somebody's attic or got handed down and is out there somewhere. I don't know.
Where is it? Where are he and his wife buried?
They are in Goshen, New York, in a cemetery there. Obviously, he died he had an accident. This is skipping ahead a little bit, I guess, but he had a cataract operation in Brooklyn and went back into the medical facility because he was having pain, and somehow perhaps trying to exit the building, encountered an open window and fell through it from the 5th floor and plunged to his death.
Oh, jeez.
He was buried in 1962. It was a back page headline on the New York Daily News, and most of it covered in with all of the New York newspapers. People knew who he was. And he was 70 years, I guess 72 years old, and just suddenly gone like that.
Oh, man. Yeah. Okay, Noel, last question. What is your next book project, and when can you expect its release?
Well, the next book that I will be finishing is actually an espionage novel. Ooh. It's the second part of one called Revolt in Berlin. It's the continuation of a series that I started in the 1980s with a book called Flowers from Berlin. The baseball books are really something I do for fun and because of my passionate interest in the sport, and it's the espionage books that sell about 20 times as many and really kind of pay the rent. The odd footnote to it is if I go to a mystery writers convention, people don't know who I am. If I go to a Saber convention, everybody knows who I am. So
that's beautiful.
Figure that out.
Beautiful. Yeah. That's beautiful. No, congratulations, and all the best of luck in selling the book. Okay.
Thank you very much, and a pleasure to talk to you, and I look forward to doing it again. Take care.
You got it. Take care. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for my next show where I will be interviewing Brittany Ingersoll. Thank you and good night.